Hello and welcome to the Sharpening Report. I am your host, Josh Peck. Today we welcome returning guest Brian Godawa to discuss his book, Moses, Against the Gods of Egypt, and the accompanying research companion, The Spiritual World of Moses and Egypt. Brian, how are you doing today?
Great, Josh. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming back on. It's been a little while. And, I was thinking about this today. It seems like every time I go on a hiatus, actually, you might not, I forgot to tell you this. This is the first interview I've done since I was on this 3-month hiatus because I was working on Skywatch stuff and then there was the holidays. But it seems like every time that happens or every time there's some new change at Sharpening Report, you're always the first in line for the new, whatever the new thing is. So
I'm the guinea pig. So.
Yes, you are. Well, I mean, my very first video interview was with you, and then I never went back. I mean, it's great. I've never went to audio only again. But so glad to have you back. And these two books, this is a little unique because you have both a fiction and a nonfiction book, but they're both dealing with the same topic. Can you give us a brief background on both books and tell us what you found beneficial about releasing both a novel and a research guide?
Yeah, well, Moses Against the Gods of Egypt is the latest novel in my Chronicles of the Watchers series. And what Chronicles of the Watchers is, it's very similar to my best-selling Chronicles of the Nephilim series, where I'm retelling historical stories. Most of them are Bible stories still, but eventually I'm going to expand out. And retelling historical stories with the context of this Watcher paradigm, the idea of, the spiritual powers, principalities and powers over the nations and what that might look like. And so that's the fictional element. But and what happened was there's a few Bible stories that I didn't get to in my Chronicles of the Nephilim, like Jezebel. I just did that one in Chronicles of Watchers, and now the Moses story, and it kind of fits in the midst of the series of Chronicles of the Nephilim, if that makes sense. And so, but in the course of these series that I've been writing, I've always written usually like in the Chronicles of the Nephilim, I would write an appendix, and I would write about the biblical and historical research behind the fiction that I was writing, because I felt that I was doing some wild stuff, obviously, and I wanted Christians to know that this isn't just, made up stuff. It's rooted in, understanding ancient Near Eastern worldview as well as the biblical worldview and how they mesh together actually a lot, and sort of to help educate, and plus because when you're retelling Bible stories, Christians have a high view of the scriptures, and they don't want you to be playing with the word of God. And I respect that. So, I did that. But as the years went on, my appendices would grow. And I realized, I got to the point in this new series, I'm like, you know what? I love doing the research, and I'm just, it wasn't much more work for me to do a little bit more and make the appendix into a book itself, a full, almost 200-page book. And that's where I realized, well, look, I'll just split the two up. And then those who, and then as you read the novel, I explain, hey, look, if you want to get the research, get this other book. And so it's sort of that expanding world, because also the novels have expanded in many ways. And, I don't think they're getting too verbose, but what happens is I'm kind of taking on some bigger projects, like, of course, the life of Moses, whereas my previous novels are a little bit more focused on, in terms of time period. The Moses novel, Against the Gods of Egypt, covers roughly his whole life, I take that back, it covers roughly from his birth until they go to Mount Sinai and launch on their way towards Canaan. And then, but it's funny too, because the material that I write, the biblical research material, actually is amongst my best-selling material as well. So, it's like in Chronicles of the Nephilim, 8 novels, I took all the appendices from all of them and put them into one book and called it When Giants Were Upon the Earth. And that is literally my best-selling book of all time. And Noah is my first novel, and that's a close behind, right? But but it's just amazing to me because I didn't realize, and of course that's what introduced me into the world where you are a part of, and thus we've talked about giants and watchers and Leviathan and all that stuff. Well, I'm still going on it with my novels, and I've got like I don't know, well, let's see, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, about 15 novels based on this paradigm of the Watcher paradigm in the Divine Council. And I didn't think that there would be so much material that would maintain such interest for so long. And it's exciting, and the latest one, whoa, it goes even more. I had thought that, sometimes you get to the point where, well, I have, have I done it all already? Have I written about all the bizarre, cool stuff in the Bible? And then you start doing some deep research, like into Moses' life, and you realize, oh no, there's a lot more yet to come. So
that's amazing. And what's so cool is you bring in a variety of characters. Obviously Moses, but you also have Zipporah, Janus and Jambres, the Amalekite giants. But you base this all on biblical truth. What most interests you about the individuals who the characters are based on?
Yeah, well, that's true because obviously when you're approaching these stories, they're full of characters, and you have to focus, right? And you have to pick. Yeah. So one of the things is that I decided when I started the whole series long ago, I decided that, I respect and even appreciate to a large degree what a lot of modern storytelling has become, where it's, there's a focus, the protagonists and stuff, there tends to be a focus on sort of minor characters, maybe in like if you're going to do a historical event, they'll focus on a minor character rather than the major historical character. And I think there's the desire to connect with the common man or something. I don't know. Maybe they feel like the old days of writing hero stories is sort of old and classical, right? And we want more. What do they call it? Deeply flawed protagonists, this kind of thing, And I'm like, I want to go back to the classic hero. And so all of mine are the big heroes of the Bible: Noah, Abraham, and of course now Moses. And that makes it difficult because people are so familiar with the story, right? And so my choice of who to focus on first was, I'm gonna do the big hero stories, right? And it's a challenge because people know so much about them. So how can you come at something with something fresh? Well, one of the biggest things that I discovered, that I continue to discover as I study, same thing with Jezebel, all these heroes of the faith. Well, the truth is they were very flawed.
Yeah.
You don't have to be a modern anti-hero to have a very flawed character. And while some Christians, very few, but there's still a lot who sort of feel like, if you show Noah as being a sinful man, you're like, the Bible says that Noah was pure, and it's like, well, you know what?
He was still human.
Yeah. But then it also said he got drunk, and it's like, same thing with David, right? The man after God's own heart who, murdered, committed adultery, right?
Yep.
So you can be a man of faith and be praiseworthy, but you're still a sinner. And so Moses was one of those characters where we're very indoctrinated by the 1957 movie with Charlton Heston and look, I know many people these days. Many young people probably have never seen the movie, but I think it's still one of the most, for some reason, one of the most influential sort of understandings of Moses, because it even influenced me. I love Charlton Heston, right? But this whole thing of, let my people go, he's got that awesome Shakespeare voice and stuff. Well, my understanding as I studied Moses was he wasn't like that. Mm-hmm. In fact, Moses had a stuttering problem.
Yeah.
And the Bible actually says that. And when you look at when he talks about, I'm not a man of eloquent speech, I'm uncircumcised of lips, you look into the Hebrew of that, and it's not just saying like, oh, I don't speak well. It's literally saying I have a speech impediment. And what that was is you look elsewhere in the Bible, that same language is used when it's referred to stuttering and such.
Wow.
So imagine a Moses who's a stutterer, right?
Yeah.
But also, he had major anger problems, and it's there in the text. He hits the rock rather than speaking to it, but it's very subtle, and you as you read it closer, you see his reactions to God are very sort of belligerent,
Right, yeah.
And so here's a man with an anger problem, and what I came to realize was, or as I was reading through the text, I started thinking, one of the unique aspects that I hope to bring to this is, think about this. Moses is a man who was, his original father is not even spoken of, just his name, right?
Yeah.
But nevertheless, his original father gives him up. They're trying to save him, but nonetheless, he never meets his original father when he's born, right? And they put him in the river, and etc. And the mother keeps up with him, but there's no mention of his father Amram. Then he's adopted by a pharaoh as a father, right? And then eventually he finds out the truth of his identity. He's not that who he is. And then that father, tries to kill him, for what he did. Then he flees off to Midian, and he meets Jethro, a Midianite man who becomes his a father figure. He actually had a great relationship with him, right? But then he has to leave him and go back to Egypt. And this whole time, the Bible never mentions his original birth father, And I was starting to think, well, how did that man struggle, with never being the father there that Moses needed? And it's not even a criticism of him, because like I said, he saved him by giving him up to the Nile, right? But still, there's ramifications on that. And so I saw a man or struggling with father issues, because never really had a true father. And yet, think about it. A large part of the story is, I think, it's not explicit in the text, but it's Moses discovering what we all have to discover, which is Yahweh is our ultimate father.
Absolutely.
And he is the father that our earthly fathers can't be anyway, right?
Yeah.
So that was some of the issues that I found very personal and fascinating about Moses. But then you think, okay, well, what about the other characters? Well, sort of the one, I think the ones that sort of become the most important are the ones that tend to have the most impact on the meaning and themes of the story. So I do have Miriam and Aaron in there because what I saw in Miriam and Aaron was, here's a brother and sister who were given very powerful roles of responsibility, high priest, and she was a prophetess. In that day and age. That's kind of odd, right? And yet there was a time where they got so jealous of Moses that you're not the only one who speaks for God, right? That's fascinating to me. And that's also something I can relate to, when you see other people, God blessing other people, or sometimes, it's the Salieri effect, like from Amadeus, Mozart, where it's like, how come you bless them but not me, that type of thing.
Yeah.
But then there's Zipporah. So Zipporah, of course, you have to have a romance.
Yeah.
And so, but here's the interesting thing. There's one verse in the Bible where it says that Aaron and Miriam get mad at Moses and they accuse him. Well, this is, you got a lot of these problems because you married a Cushite wife. And you're like, well, who is that Cushite wife? The only one that's mentioned is Zipporah, but she's Midianite. And Cushite is actually a name. Cush was south of Egypt. They were I wouldn't say perpetual enemies, but perpetual adversaries. You know what I mean? Like, they would trade with each other, but then they would have times of history where they would battle back and forth. And anyway, it's basically Ethiopia. So that's a black woman, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of relevant in today's world, I thought that was interesting, interracial marriage. But here's the problem. Zipporah, Midian is the opposite side of the world. So did he have more than one wife? And if he did, how come that she was never mentioned, right?
Right.
So these are some issues. And by the way, that's just the tip of the iceberg, or the tip of the pyramid of the amount of issues that I had to find, controversial issues. We can talk about those next. The historicity and all that kind of stuff of the Exodus. But Zipporah, so you look into the scholarship, and there's several possibilities. One is that he married a Cushite wife and she died in some way. But it's interesting because I found I want to call it legendary, but a legend, but it's written by two different ancient Jewish historians, Josephus and Artapanus, both ancient. And it's a story about Moses that's not in the Bible. And I don't want to say legend because then that makes it sound like it's false, but it's not necessarily. It might be, but the point is they may have had access to ancient literature that we no longer have. In fact, they did. They did, right? So, and there's the story where Moses was a general of Pharaoh, and some interesting things about that. But anyway, he was a real smart, and he was took the Egyptian army and went south to conquer back the Egyptian lands that Cush had been taking.
Oh, wow.
And he went to the head city, which is probably Kerma at the time. And there's a story about how, also there's this cool story about how, that I put in the novel, about flying snakes and Moses countering the flying snakes. You know, the seraphim that you hear about in the Bible?
Yeah.
Well, there's an additional story that they were in Egypt, and how he had this brilliant plan of how he overcame, because they were venomous, and how's the army going to get through with all these snakes, right? So I put that in there as well. But then also, when he surrounds the city, the siege of Kerma, this capital city, the princess of the city sees him from the city walls and falls in love with him. Okay, it's like love at first sight, you know?
Yeah.
My editor's like, when I wrote this in there, my editor's like, this is like Disney. I love it at first sight. I said, well, look, it's ancient literature, man. I'm just following the storyline, you know?
Yeah.
Anyway, she falls in love with him, and they get married as a treaty between Cush and Egypt, see?
Oh, wow.
And, of course, if she's a Cushite princess, maybe she's the black woman, you know?
Yeah.
But there's a problem here, because when he leaves into the desert, why would he leave his Cushite wife, number one?
Yeah.
Because if he was wanted, she would be punished. And if he brought her with him, which is what because he was leaving Egypt for good as far as he was concerned, right?
Right.
Why would he leave her? He wouldn't leave her. But then if he brought her, why would it talk as if he's completely alone? I mean,
yeah.
So anyway, I won't explain how I solved that, but I came up with some cool stuff, also rooted in some other legendary stories about Moses from ancient historians, about how there was an attempted assassination on Moses before he left, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, and then the other thing is there's a possibility that Zipporah, maybe, since Midianites are trading nomads, maybe he could have a second wife who's a Cushite wife. And I'm sorry, Jethro, I'm speaking about
right.
Jethro, right? And maybe Zipporah could be one of his 7 daughters of a second wife, that she could be Cushite, and she could be called Cushite because she's black, and that's how they see them, So that's possible too. So there's all these different possibilities, and as a storyteller, I have to integrate those and try to make sense of all of them, and those are fascinating. And I love romance anyway. So there's a long distance romance as Moses goes back to Egypt, leaves Zipporah. There's them falling in love in Midian. So these were, I want to write an entertaining story. So it's just as important to me as the theology. It really is. And so I try to choose those characters that will be entertaining, interesting themes, and etc. So two of those main characters in the novel are also characters who are sort of legendary, and that you mentioned them already, Janus and Jambres. And I'll end with these 2 characters because I think your audience would like this.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Bible, the magicians of Pharaoh are never named. As a matter of fact, in Egypt, the magician in English is the sort of the Hebrew word for the Egyptian word lector priests. So they were they're called magicians from the Hebrew worldview because they did magic, and that's true. But they were much more than that. They were lector priests of the Temple of Ra. So they had a lot of responsibilities. It wasn't like the magicians going around, doing sleight of hand and all that kind of stuff, right? So, but magic was a very important integrated part of the Egyptian worldview, and they really did believe in the power of words and formulas. And I did all this study on it, and I put it into the novel too, where actual formulas of things that they would say, to conjure up and such. But it's not so much like the magical abracadabra, so much as they believed in the power of the word, because their gods, Ptah, or other gods, created the world. They had many different myths, but one of them was that Ptah created by speaking forth. And so they believe that if you got the right words, you'd be able to get the gods to do what you ask them. And but also spells and incantations were about that same thing. In other words, if someone's sick, I can transfer that sickness into a little figurine so that they can get well. But it's interesting, they weren't quite advanced civilization at the time, so they had a difference between medicine and magic. They did both. Kind of like, not too different from the way religious people today. Yeah, we pray, but we have doctors, right?
Right.
And they had the same thing, and they had a difference of between epilepsy seizure versus a demon possession. They we may disagree with where they drew the line, but they had a difference. And so anyway, the magicians are never named, but in the book of Second Timothy, I think, First or Second Timothy, Paul mentions the magicians of Pharaoh, and he names them as Jannes and Jambres. That's the only place. Nowhere else in the Old Testament are they named Jannes and Jambres. So where did Paul get this, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's all kinds of theories, but suffice it to say that there is a ancient pseudepigraphal book called Jannes and Jambres.
Oh, wow.
And it tells their story, their side of the story, of sort of their encounter with Moses, but also they were brothers who, one actually repented or, saw that, no, this God of the Moses, we should turn, and the other one didn't. So it's kind of an interesting, an interesting dramatic journey there, and they have a Hebrew background, so they became Egyptian magicians with this Hebrew background.
Wow.
So I incorporated a whole storyline of Jannes and Jambres from their perspective as they go through their life and interact with the Egyptian worldview and such, and then how they ultimately encounter Moses and stuff. And so that was, so I love to draw from ancient literature. And one of the other things that I do is I drew from the ancient Egyptian mythology. So one of the other factors in all of my novels that I do is I like to bring home the worldview, the pagan worldview that Israel is interacting with. Mm-hmm. But think of it in this way, though. Israel had been in Egypt for 480 years or something like that, right? So, and the complaint was that a lot of them had fallen away, and many didn't even know the name of Yahweh, right? Mm-hmm. So there's they've been very heavily influenced. So they thought this way too, not the least of which is Moses, who was raised as an Egyptian. He doesn't even know Yahweh's name until the Mount Sinai at 80 years old. So This is fact, right? Well, anyway, so what was this Egyptian worldview like, and how did it influence the way they saw the world and saw things? And so I tried to study the mythology and all the gods, and boy, they have a lot of them. Egypt had a lot of gods, and they had a lot of myths, and a lot of them were contradictory, because basically they weren't based on logic. They were based on explaining things, and they didn't care if, they swapped gods out with each other at different stories and all this kind of stuff, because the point of it was to tell the truth in a spiritual way that could make sense to them. Well, anyway, they also had a view of the underworld. And, those of us who know the Bible, know Sheol, right? Mm-hmm. And the Egyptian name for it was Duat.
Oh, okay.
And it was different. There were similarities, obviously, because they all believed in a underworld. But the Egyptian world was unique and had its own kind of version of that, and what happens to you and how you ultimately, when you die, you start on your journey on the river Vernus in the underworld towards the judgment hall of Osiris, where your heart is measured against the feather of justice. Mm-hmm. So there's this whole worldview that I was able to bring into the story through a vision type context, mm-hmm. to show this Egyptian worldview and how it interacts. And then, of course, there's the spiritual reality. I have the angels and demons, the watchers, and the archangels, and so I tell a story that okay, one of the things that, boy, I'm just rambling on here. I hope.
Oh, you're fine. Okay. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So the gods and stuff. So it was fascinating, though. It really is fascinating. I mean, I'm very genuinely curious about all these different gods of various nations, and especially when you start to think that there might be a spiritual reality behind them, and it kind of makes it more interesting. And, I know Derek Gilbert has done a lot of writing on this stuff as well down that path, and so it does make you curious and interested. But in contrast to Israel, because ultimately, obviously, Israel's God is the God above all gods. But one of the reasons why I wrote this novel, I realized I had to go back and, in my Chronicles of Nephilim series, I wrote a book about Joshua's conquest.
Yeah.
And Caleb after that. And why didn't I write Moses? Well, at the time, there wasn't any giants in the Moses story, and I was kind of focusing on stories in the Bible where there was a mention of giants. Or watchers, but I was a little wrong because, well, there were certainly watchers, but I just didn't see it at the time, and I was focusing on other stuff. So the thing that inspired me was to write the novel was Exodus 12:12, where God's talking about the judgment, the plagues, and He says, "I will execute judgment on all the gods of Egypt."
Yeah,
and I'm like, well, that's interesting. Within our understanding and paradigm, this isn't just I will metaphorically wage war, but it's like, well, there's some spiritual demonic reality behind these gods, so what would that look like?
Right.
And that's where I realized there's a lot of watchers here, because I'm thinking these plagues, the power of the plagues related to the gods. Well, it's not so simple. But before I step there, I just wanted to address the fact that also the thing about the giants was, there was no outward mention of giants, but as I studied the story, I realized that after the Exodus had occurred and they're on their way to Mount Sinai, they had an interaction with the Amalekite roaming tribe of nomads, right? Mm-hmm. And the Amalekites, it's the one where Moses holds up his staff and they're winning, and he lowers it and they're losing, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, but the interesting thing is that there are some passages in the Bible where the Amalekites are linked to giant tribes. Now, it's not like the Zamzummim, the Anakim, and stuff like that, because they're a normal tribe of nomads. But there's one passage in Genesis 14, I think it is, with the battle of the 5 kings, was it, or 6 kings? And that was like in Abraham's day, where these kings came, and it talks about them conquering all these giant clans in the days of Abraham, right? Mm-hmm. So the Zamzummim, the Rephaim, the Anakim, but it also mentions the Amalekites, So there, I think that the context of that is that they're probably giant clans and stuff. Mm-hmm. So I realized that there might have been a giant connection there that might have been going on. And secondly, I study, so I'm following this Egyptologist named David Roll. We could talk about him because he affects who's the pharaoh of the Exodus. But one of the things that he's uncovered is there's been a scarab, which is sort of a kind of like a seal, found in Jericho during the times of Joshua, that had the name of Sheshai on it. Huh. And of course, Sheshai is one of the 3 Anakim giant brothers that are mentioned multiple times in the book of Joshua. And my novel, Joshua Valiant, has those brothers, Sheshai, Talmai, and Ahiman. Mm-hmm. But of course, David Roll is not a believer. He doesn't believe in the giants, but he makes the argument that Sheshai, because there's an Egyptian connection there, Sheshai may have been part of the Hyksos tribes that invaded Egypt after the Jews left, and because they were also Semitic tribes, and that he may have established the bulkhead there in the Goshen, and they established a worship of Baal instead of Set, and then came back to Canaan, right, mm-hmm. where you've got the evidence of him. So that was really fascinating. So Sheshai is a giant in my stories, and I thought, okay, there's another way in that I can write. So I have Sheshai appear, in the story, so there's sort of like a melding of characters from the Nephilim series. And yeah, so that's some of the material behind the storytelling. But we can also talk a little bit about the historical archaeological stuff, if that's what you're interested in.
Sure, yeah, and I definitely wanted to add, because you mentioned something about the 10 plagues, and one of the most fascinating parts of your book, the research part, was making a connection to the creation account in Genesis. But before we get to that, we are going to switch over to members only for the rest of this interview. But before we do, for people watching for free, Brian, what would you want most for the audience to take away from your books?
Well, look, you can get all my material at Amazon.com in paperback, ebook, or audiobook. Most all my books are. And there's you can go there and find everything on me if you want. But if you want to go even more in depth, go to Godawa.com. That's my name, Godawa.com. And I have lots of material about everything I'm writing and freebies and articles and all that kind of stuff. But so I'm writing these books to inspire a greater love for the scriptures, that people will see it through fresh eyes and see the divine counsel paradigm, the watcher paradigm, to understand the Bible within a bit more of that context, which gives it a new, fresh look, not a Gnostic new, secret knowledge, but more it's in plain sight, but we just didn't have the eyes to see because we were focused on our modern view instead of the ancient Near Eastern view. So I want people to get back to seeking to understand the Bible within the ancient Near Eastern context, because it will answer a lot of our modern doubts and questions that we have about the Bible, like science and all that kind of stuff, and history and all this, understanding it through their eyes. And so my novels are a way of incarnating that so that you get it through entertainment as well as facts melded together in a way that, okay, so that's how I can now understand the picture from a different perspective. And I've had many people tell me, Brian, you've given me a fresh appreciation for scriptures. I'm going back and I'm rereading these stories and appreciating them anew. And so that's been my goal all along.
That's absolutely fantastic, and I've heard the same even from some of our own audience whenever we have you on, that your books have had that impact. So that is excellent. Anybody who has not checked out Brian's books, I highly suggest you do so. Okay, we are going to go to members only. So if you don't yet have a membership, head on over to dailyrenegade.com, sign up, and you will get the rest of this interview, plus full versions of every show we produce, including hosts such as Gary Wayne, Brian Melvin, Pastor Mike Spalding, and so much more at dailyrenegade.com. All right, members, hang on the line. Everyone else viewing for free on YouTube, Rumble, or elsewhere, thank you so much for joining us. Take care. God bless.